Professor Daniela Ovadia, co-director of the Neuroscience and Society Lab at the University of Pavia. Daniela has a medical and neuroscience background. She's also a science journalist and a science communicator, specialized in public involvement and participatory processes on controversial issues related to science. She works as a consultant in ethics and neuroscience since 2008, and for many institutions and universities in Italy and abroad. She took part into EU projects in the field of ethics, responsible research and innovation, and ethics management. She's has also been involved in one of the HBP info of ICT platforms, the medical informatics platforms.
What's my involvement in the medical informatics platform of the Human Brain Project? As Karen told, I'm the co-director of the Neuroscience and Society Lab at University of Pavia. The director of the lab is Professor Gabriella Bottini. She's also the director of the Clinical Neuropsychology department at Ospedale Niguarda, which is one of the biggest Italian hospitals. Ospedale Niguarda is a huge hospital in Milan. As you see, we have around 1,000 beds, and we have around 2.5 million outpatient visits per year. So we have huge databases and records. Our hospital was, we are consultants as university for ethical issues for Niguarda Hospital, and the hospital was involved since the beginning in the medical informatics platform. I think it's important if we have people listening to us that are not directly involved in the Human Brain Project to explain a little bit how the platform works. And how an hospital can join it. Our hospital joined what was called the Federated Network of Hospitals and Centers. That is actually the initial medical informatics platform of the Human Brain Project. It's part of the sub-project 8. Each hospital contributes with the data available to the network, sharing clinical data and research data. And in theory, we will also benefit from the large amount of data available through the platform. How does it work? We have what is called a local data mirror that has been created. So that seems we have a server where our data are stored in Niguarda Hospital, and we share there all the data we have on patients with diseases of the brain of all types, that mean neurological and also psychiatric. The local data mirror is connected to a general server of the platform that runs 3 software packages. What the so-called federation and integration client, I will describe it a little bit more later, and a query execution engine, which is a sort of Google to share the data and to send queries to the system, and of course an interface to use it. What will the platform do? What we hope the platform will do will be to visualize the type of data that are available in the network and provide them to a user through a website. That means that a user can formulate a query to the system. Just to give you an example, how many patients with Alzheimer's disease have a specific genetic pattern in the available data set? This is the kind of question that a user can ask. The user expressed the query and to what's called the federation client, which is the server, and the client rewrites the query in a set of subqueries that is directed to the nodes of the network. This is a very important step that reflects also, that has also implications for the informed consent. And after receiving all such subqueries from the interrogated nodes, the federation client composes them, provides the visualization to the user, a summary, and sometimes also statistical facilities, and send back what we call interpretable answers to the user. So the results are sent back in what is called an aggregate form. Aggregate form means that we don't know and we are unable as a user to disaggregate the data into the single data that compose the results. This is a picture I took from an article written by Richard Fracovia and Harry Markham and published in Philosophical Transaction of the Royal Society. And it represents a sort of small exercise that reflects what you can do with such kind of platform. This figure represents the subgroups of individuals of advanced age that have, and the red dots are the individuals that have cognitive symptoms, and the blue are the ones that don't have cognitive symptoms. This representation comes out from a data set that contains clinical, imaging, proteomic, cerebrospinal fluid proteins, genotyping of a large number of patients from 3 different hospitals. So what we can have from this kind of data set, if we do an exercise of data mining, is to understand, let's say, how many Alzheimer's patients have also genetic modification, or how many patients without cognitive impairment have the same genetic modification that we see in Alzheimer's, and so on, with many, many parameters. So you can understand how powerful is this tool to reshape our diagnostic criteria in many diseases. There are some data protections that were tools that were implemented within the system. The first one is that the clinical data will be depersonalized and anonymized at the hospital. I mean, no personalized data will leave our hospital, and all the data will reside on memory disks that are installed only for this purpose, and will remain under the IT management of each center that is involved in the platform. At no stage, data on an individual level will leave the firewall that protects each center. So it will be impossible to reconstitute the whole set of data of an individual. And the other important thing is that the aggregation of data into sub-answers, the reason why a query is divided into sub-queries and is recomposed in sub-answers that are provided at the end, is that it's another protection that offers an opportunity to encrypt the data. The legal reference for data protection in the EU, we discussed it in a previous presentation. Of course, we have the EU Data Protection Directive, an opinion on the e-privacy directive that was expressed in 2013. We have, of course, the national legal frameworks related to the nationality of the research partners, but on top of this, we have the new regulation of the European Parliament, the one that was mentioned before, that will come into that will be used since May 2018. I think it's important to go back to some definition in this regulation. The first one is the definition of personal data, that is any information relating to an identifier or identifiable natural person. And I think that, as you can imagine, the original data that we have on our platform are, without any doubt, personal data. There are also a definition of what we intend by processing personal data. That means collecting, recording, organizing, adapting, consulting those data. And of course, there is also the transmission of the data and the dissemination of the data. So again, surely the platform will undergo under this new regulation. And we also have an issue of profiling. That means that under the new regulation, profiling is defined as any form of automated processing of personal data to evaluate certain personal aspects related to a natural person, and in particular to analyze or predict aspects concerning and health is explicitly mentioned. So again, we are under this definition. So what are the relevant issues for the informed consent? I would say that in terms of informed consent as intended by the European and Italian law, the medical informatics platform requires the patient to give a general consent on the use of his or her medical records within the hospital. And this is because the data never leave the firewall of the ICT of the hospital in an identifiable way. And this was, let's say, an ICT tool that was developed exactly to avoid any issue of shared data, personal data. The general informed consent that each patient signs at the entry of our hospital in Italy provides such an authorization. And as it is impossible because of the aggregate nature of the data to go back to the individual, to the information on individual, no other specific consent is legally required in Italy. But ethics sometimes goes beyond the law. And this is a citation from an article by Nicholas Rose published in Neuron in 2014. And he says that, of course, most patients who have been treated for psychiatric and neurological disorder in European hospitals have not given their informed consent for their record to be collated and mined in the way proposed by the Human Brain Project. So the question is, how can this data legitimately be used? And he answered that the anonymization of the data would solve many of these problems, but I'm not sure that it will solve all the problems as we saw earlier. We also have a problem of data property. And again, I cite from the article by Nicholas Rose, that particularly concerns them to be the possibility that the data could be sold to private corporation or exploited for profit rather than for the public good. And of course, there is a debate around this, but I think that it's important to share the last sentence. Two rather basic principles collide. Data as personal property to be protected for the good of the individual versus data as a potential public good to be used for the benefit of fellow citizens, the hundreds and thousands of them afflicted by brain disease. And an answer to this two basic principles, to the collision between these two basic principles is, of course, included in the new regulation. But as ethicists, we should discuss if we agree totally with what's the new regulation and if we think that the legal framework resolves any ethical issue. And finally, there are things that goes far beyond the informed consent, in my personal view. The questions are, should every patient be informed about the final goal of the platform to reshape the classification of brain disease? I mean, what about the patient that has a psychiatric disease and wants to know what will be in the future, maybe the name or the diagnosis of his disease? Should we inform the society about the possible impact of such a new classification of diseases in terms of number of diagnoses, therapies, and possible new stigma? We don't know what the results will be. Should we start asking every single patient in our hospital to give explicit consent to the use of his data for data mining? This is also a question that, as a hospital, we are discussing if we have to ask for explicit consent. So those are my questions that I would like to share with the ethics community.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe I can start there. And picking up on your final questions with regards to the ethical acceptability and for example, of data mining. So it's my understanding that the medical informatics platform goes through ethics approval for the use of the data on a hospital per hospital basis. So they go, in your case, to your hospital's ethics committee and say, is it okay from your perspective if you can use the data? And if the hospital ethics committee says no, then it's over. And at that point, the HBP will pull out and not go ahead. So I was wondering, and that of course does not imply individual consent. So the hospital ethics committee can then say, yes, for these purposes, you're allowed to do that. So I'd be interested in your view on the relationship between the hospital ethics committee and the individual patient. Do you think it's legitimate to take this approach that the hospital ethics committee actually makes the decision for the individual patient?
I think it's a very broad question. I don't think I have a final answer to this. It depends on what value we put before. I mean, it's exactly the clash between the collective benefits that could derive from the use of those data and the individual benefits. I would say that I would suggest some, let's call, sort of remedial actions. I would like the whole Human Brain Project to provide a feedback to the society about the use of this data and a broad sharing of the discoveries of this platform. I mean, as I was saying, what if we have a new classification for psychiatric diseases that goes far beyond the DSM that we use now, that, as you know, is deeply discussed because it's based on symptoms. I think that it's very, very important to bring back the benefits not only to the medical community, but really to the society. If we can't go back to the individual patient, at least we should organize something for the community that provide the data. And maybe even at our local hospital, we should organize ongoing participatory activities to bring back the results to the community. Of course, if we accept the fact that the general benefit has a larger is more important than the individual one. But we have many, I mean, we use those data for economic reasons yet. I mean, our regional health service goes to the data set, and we have activities of data mining to plan our economic involvement in the health system for epidemiological reasons. So I would say that we have a lot of background, solid background to decide that we can use them. But anyway, as I was saying, I think that it's important to bring back to the society the results.
Okay, thank you. That's, by the way, it's probably worth mentioning. This is something that the European Commission ethics reviewers have also raised on several occasions, that they would like to see a clearer feedback on the benefits of the project that goes back to the people, to the data subjects, people that the data originates from.
If I could suggest there as well, this is a point where the sort of political impact of the project comes out of the ethical concerns. Because, as you mentioned, it has the potential to change the way groups are seen, and to re-stigmatize or to newly stigmatize different groups. So the openness carries that sort of risk, but at the same time, it also helps to mitigate the idea of commercial exploitation. So if someone takes the data and somehow makes profit off it, which in the stuff that DVT have done so far and the work that they've carried out, that's been a thing that's alarmed a lot of citizens, the idea that their data could be used for profit. So the openness would help to mitigate that, because if something's open and available, well, it's hard to profit from it, but at the same time, it's got these risks of stigma. So it shows this continuum between the research, the ethics, and politics.
Yes, in another way, I think it's very difficult to prevent any commercial use, because if we shape in a different way the diagnosis of cognitive decline or any kind of degenerative disease, of course, pharmaceutical industries will be interested in knowing what are let's imagine the genetic patterns for the diagnosis, the imaging findings that defines a diagnosis in a specific patient, and they will probably also use their start new research on the use of their drugs in specific subgroups. So it's very difficult, but on the other hand, it's exactly what we want. We want more drugs that works. We don't want drugs that are used without a solid biological basis. So I think we should really explain to the society that there are also let's say, good way of using commercially the results of basic research. This is an issue that we always have with basic research. Even when you identify a new genetic target for cancer, you have the same problem. The genetic target is identified in general by a non-profit institution or a research center, and then it is used by a drug company to develop a treatment. So we should try to explain how and when a commercial use is beneficial and when we decide that it is not.
I think that one of the really difficult problems is that we can technically solve the issues about identification and sort of the individual harm that might come to people by their data being identified, but there are at least potentially projects where we have reason to believe that if we ask people, would you let your data be used for this, they would say no. And it might not be the whole population, 90% or 80% might be happy to participate, but we have good reason to believe that 20% or 10% wouldn't. So what do we do in those circumstances? It's difficult to see that it's something that can be mediated by an ethics committee. Should it take sort of how should it make its decision? I can't come up with a good example for how it could happen in your project, in the Human Brain Project, but I think we have a good example from Denmark from a couple of years ago, because in Denmark you can use people's health data without their consent and without ethics committee approval, and the Danish researcher studied the link between the circumcision of boys and various childhood disorders, including autism. And it's fairly obvious that if the parents had been asked, would you let this person use your data for these specific things, at least some of them would have said no, partly because the researcher is a prominent anti-circumcision spokesman, apart from being a bona fide epidemiologist. So how do we mediate those conflicts? That, I think, is a really difficult problem for research ethics.